Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping straight into a real-life financial noir. And to really wrap our heads around this, I want you to just picture this scene in your mind. Okay, it's June 25th, 2020. The sun is setting on this small, slick, rain-soaked airfield just outside Vienna. The whole world seems painted in these deep charcoal and steel blue shadows. And there's a man, early 40s, wearing a tailored suit, and he's just walking calmly across the wet tarmac toward a chartered private jet. Now, just 48 hours earlier, this exact same man was the chief operating officer of one of Germany's absolute biggest, most celebrated tech companies. But tonight, as he steps into that jet, he's walking away from the smoldering wreckage of a corporate empire, and he's about to disappear from the face of the earth entirely.
So why is he running? Well, it comes down to a number. 1.9 billion euros. That's a won with a whole lot of zeros. You see, on the exact same day our fugitive boards his flight, a 24 billion euro German tech giant officially declares bankruptcy for one simple, terrifying reason. This massive sum of money, which was supposedly the very bedrock of their entire global operation, has just evaporated into thin air. I mean, it wasn't misplaced, it wasn't temporarily frozen in some weird account. It turns out it just never actually existed.
The man stepping onto that jet to Minsk is Jan Marsalek. He basically leaves behind an absolute crater in the European economy and vanishes into the ether. Today, in this explainer, we are going to unpack the incredible source material behind the Wirecard scandal. We're going to explore exactly how an entire nation fell for mirage and how Marsalek built this impossible machine that fooled literally everyone, right up until the moment he goes to the world.
Act 1. The Turtleneck Messiah.
To really understand how this grand illusion ended, we have to look at where it all began. Wirecard didn't actually start out as some glamorous corporate titan. It was born back in the 1999 dot-com bubble, and honestly, it nearly died shortly after. But then, in 2002, a man named Markus Braun took over as CEO. And Braun, he cultivated a very, very specific image. He favored these rimless glasses and a black turtleneck, and he'd speak in this slow, deliberate way about artificial intelligence and a completely cashless future. Essentially, he looked exactly like the visionary Steve Jobs figure that German investors were just absolutely desperate for. Under his leadership, the company pivoted hard to processing credit card payments for the gray zones of the internet, gambling and adult sites. Fast forward to 2018, and this company from a quiet little Munich suburb achieves the unthinkable. It enters the DAX. That's Germany's elite index of its 30 most valuable companies. They actually knocked out the 150-year-old Commerzbank just to take its place.
Okay, let's dive into how this machine supposedly worked. While Markus Braun was playing the philosopher king back in Munich, his COO, Jan Marsalek, was flying all across Asia, supposedly building a massive empire. But here's the catch. Wirecard didn't actually hold the licenses to process payments in a lot of these Asian countries. So what did they do? They used what they called third-party acquirers. These were supposedly local partner firms that handled the transactions on Wirecard's behalf and then passed along the profits into these massive Asian escrow accounts. The contrast here was completely absurd. Back in Germany, you had thousands of real engineers doing actual, tangible work in a massive glass headquarters, led by this highly visible CEO. But the illusion powering it all, the bulk of their profits, the actual engine driving a mind-boggling 24 billion euro valuation, was supposedly coming from these tiny, incredibly obscure Asian storefronts. In one documented case, a partner firm was literally registered to the home of a retired sailor. No joke. And yet, year after year, auditors signed off, regulators nodded along, and those stock charts just kept glowing that beautiful money green. Act 2. The Reporter and the Regulator. Eventually, those glowing green numbers just stopped making sense to anyone actually paying close attention, setting up this bizarre high-stakes conflict. On one side, you have Dan McCrum, an investigative reporter at the Financial Times, who literally spent years digging into Wirecard's impossible margins and exposing forged contracts. On the other side, you have BaFin. That is the German state financial regulator. Now, in a normal world, you'd expect the regulator to investigate the company after reading these explosive reports, right? Well, instead, as the source material neutrally outlines, BaFin effectively threw a massive shield over Wirecard. In an absolutely unprecedented move, they banned the short selling of Wirecard stock to protect the company's price, and then they went ahead and filed a criminal complaint against the journalist for market manipulation. This move essentially created a toxic fortress of denial. The Financial Times began warning the public way back in 2015. By 2019, an actual whistleblower inside Wirecard's Singapore office exposed hard evidence of forgeries, but internal management just quietly buried it. Meanwhile, journalists and vocal critics were being physically followed and surveilled.
The truly fascinating psychological element here, and it's a huge takeaway, is how every single institution just leaned on the others. Investors totally trusted the rising stock charts because the state regulators defended the company, and the regulators assumed the auditors were doing their jobs. Everybody just assumed someone else had checked the vault to see if the cash was actually there.
But eventually, the pressure just became too much. Wirecard's own shareholders demanded an independent review to clear things up, and the company was forced to hire KPMG to conduct a special audit. For 6 agonizing months, KPMG dug through the dark archives of the company's Asian business. And finally, in April 2020, they released a statement. It was wrapped in very careful, dry corporate language, but it amounted to this absolutely devastating quote. They could not verify that the money existed. And with that single sentence, the bright green ticker of Wirecard stock finally started to sicken and fade to gray.
Act 3. 4 days in June.
We are now entering the breathless, catastrophic final days where a 24 billion euro empire literally burns to the ground in under a week. On June 18th, Wirecard's regular auditors finally demand direct, undeniable proof from the banks in the Philippines. The banks write back and essentially say, "We've never heard of you. These documents are completely forged." That very same night, a new compliance executive named James Freeze sits down with the paperwork and on his literal first day on the job, uncovers that the entire Asian business is a total fabrication. From there, the dominoes fall incredibly fast. On the 19th, CEO Marcus Braun resigns and Marsalek is suspended. On the 22nd comes the unthinkable public admission: the 1.9 billion euros simply does not exist. And by Thursday the 25th, the company files for insolvency, and Jan Marsalek makes his ghost-like exit from that wet tarmac in Vienna.
And finally, Act 4. The Priest of Lipetsk.
Now, if you think this explainer ends with a simple, albeit dramatic, corporate bankruptcy, brace yourself. But before we get to the wild espionage twist, we have to look at the human crater left behind here. 50,000. That is the number of ordinary retail shareholders. We're talking pension savers, retirees, just everyday people who lost roughly 24 billion euros in value. They lost everything because they truly believed they were investing in Germany's technological future, and because the state's regulatory shield made them feel safe. The money might have been a hallucination, but I promise you, the financial damage to these people was incredibly real.
And the architects of this massive disaster, they met bizarrely different fates. Today, Marcus Braun, the turtleneck messiah himself, sits in a high-security prison cell in Munich. His defense strategy? He insists he was completely deceived by his team and that he is actually the real victim here. Meanwhile, Jan Marsalek is quite literally a ghost. Investigators discovered he vanished into Russia and has been living under a completely stolen identity, posing on paper, believe it or not, as a Russian Orthodox priest from the city of Lipetsk.
But Marsalek wasn't just hiding out in Moscow, and this is where the story goes full Cold War noir. Get this. In March 2025, a London courtroom convicted a spy cell that had been actively surveilling journalists and military sites across Europe on behalf of Russian intelligence. The bombshell? Prosecutors formally identified Jan Marsalek as the key link giving this cell its instructions. Investigators now strongly suspect his relationship with Russian intelligence goes back years, deep into his tenure at Wirecard, which raises a truly terrifying question. Was one of Germany's most valuable, celebrated companies quietly operating as a massive data harvesting platform for foreign intelligence right under Europe's nose the whole time?
So what's the big takeaway here? It's that the most dangerous lies are always the ones a society desperately wants to believe. Wirecard didn't succeed for so long because it was some invisible, perfectly hidden mastercrime. It succeeded because seeing the fraud for what it was treated as unpatriotic. Germany so desperately wanted to prove it had a tech giant to rival Silicon Valley that its own trusted institutions fiercely protected a mirage, going so far as to prosecute the very people trying to tell them the house was on fire. We've explored the dark corners of this financial noir today, from the neon glow of fake profits to the cold snow of a Moscow hideout. But as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. Looking back at this massive crater of failed oversight, who do you think failed the hardest here? Was it the auditors who just rubber-stamped those forged letters? The state regulator who actually attacked the journalists sounding the alarm? Or the investors who blindly chased the green charts and just refused to listen to the warnings? Drop your verdict in the comments below, and always, always keep questioning the numbers you see. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer.